Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 10 of Game Changers. It's episode 10, it's crazy. And today we're going to be doing an episode about building better leaders. So as usual, some housekeeping rules before we begin. Firstly, this session is being recorded and the recording will be uploaded to our website probably a week from now. So go check it out and go check out our other videos. Javen will paste the link in the chat. Secondly, the default chat settings, actually it sends messages to moderators only. So remember to switch it to public if you want everyone to see your messages. And thirdly, we'll be answering all Q&A at the end of the session. So pop any questions that you have using the Q&A feature and we'll answer at the end. And finally, fourthly, as usual, MiniClip is sponsoring 2 20-pound vouchers to active participants. And what is active? If you ask any questions or participate in the chat, you are an active participant, and we'll be doing the draw at the end of the episode. So when Javian and I were brainstorming this episode, we kind of been hearing and reading a lot about many examples of bad leadership in the games industry, and I'm sure all of you have as well. And a lot of this has resulted in some pretty bad events for employees and also for our players. So that's why we invited Shannon Banks here to help us figure out a part of this puzzle, which is how do we grow ourselves to be the leaders that our industry needs? So Shannon is the first action learning coach certified in the UK, and action learning is a type of coaching that helps teams solve problems together, which is something our industry needs, people coming together to solve problems. So she's one of only 20 global coaches to obtain the Master Action Learning Coach qualification, and she runs B Leadership, which is a leadership development company that supports leaders to make stronger business and social impact. So she works with big companies like UNICEF, Coca-Cola, Microsoft, MiniClip, and more. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Javian to start the session.
Thank you, Kat, and hi again, Shannon.
Thank you
for joining us. We have to thank Sarah for connecting us as well for this episode. As Kat mentioned, we have been thinking a lot about leadership, especially for women in the games industries. And we wanted to see and find and share ways in which how people can do better in terms of leadership, because we hear it all the time, right? And I think one of the most interesting things was you've mentioned that you've worked with leaders from different types of industries, not just in games. So are there any differences in the issues that you think are faced by leaders across these industries? And what are the common traits, if any?
Thank you, Javian. Well, first, let me just say thank you for inviting me to be part of this series. And I'm really delighted to join all the other female leaders and speakers who've been part of the series in the past. So thank you for the opportunity. And nice to meet all of you who are online. So I really think one of the greatest things about leaving corporate life and starting my own business was getting an opportunity to really interact with and engage with leaders from all sorts of different industries. I spent a long time in the tech industry and really loved that, but having a chance to look across industries is just amazing. And one of the things I've learned is that actually there are a lot of similarities in the challenges that are faced across leaders. And you'd be totally surprised you look at a wide range of diverse companies, organizations, diversity, sizes, sectors, even countries, and you get quite a lot of similarity in what leaders are facing. And leaders often feel like they're really alone in the challenges they have. And sometimes we get a chance to bring leaders from different industries and different companies together, and they're totally shocked that other people are facing the same challenges they are. So I would say the biggest learning for me has been that actually there are more commonalities than differences across the different sectors.
Can you share an example of what one of these common problems are?
Yeah, so, well, my company focuses on social leadership. And so we've looked at what the challenges are that leaders are facing in today's world, in the modern workplace. And we think there are two main things that are really challenging for leaders right now. And we've started working on these before COVID and the pandemic, but I'd say these are amplified by the pandemic. So the first thing is about connection. So we have lots and lots of connectivity, and I am a huge technology fan, of course, don't get me wrong, but connectivity on its own is far less useful as a leadership skill and can almost even drive segregation instead of connection between people if it's not used well. And you see that in COVID, right? Where some leaders really struggle to have good connections with their teams when they're working just online. So having true connection, like human connection, real relationships with people is something I think is a challenge. And when done really well, it's very powerful in the modern workplace. The other thing is how quickly everything is changing. And once again, I mean, COVID is a prime example of that. Who would have expected we'd be where we are now 3 years ago? Just we wouldn't. And so I think leaders, as we get more and more senior especially, have to learn skills around what we call context leadership, which is about dealing with this change and complexity and ambiguity and stepping above that to some degree and not just relying on content expertise, but providing context leadership. So that means having enough context to step in when they need to, and also providing enough context that people can be effective and efficient and make decisions on their own autonomously.
So if I can summarize, for context leadership, do you mean giving people the whys to what they're doing, providing more purpose into their roles?
Absolutely. And sometimes the what, but less of the how, so that they can make decisions. Because if you have a command and control type of decision making, which I realize is less common in the tech industry, but is definitely still around, it's really slow because decisions have to go all the way up to the top and then come back down again. And it's not a competitive way of working anymore. Like, we just live in too fast-paced world. So if leaders can learn instead to leverage their content knowledge and set context so that other people can make decisions, it's far more effective.
Right. Can we go back and talk a little bit about connection? Because I think that's quite interesting that you've mentioned that, because sometimes you read that sometimes leaders don't know where to draw the line. Do they have to treat their team members as a family, or do they have to treat the teams as teams? What are your thoughts on that in terms of building connection?
Well, okay, certainly there is a difference between family and employees, but I would say I often describe skills on as a pendulum that's swinging, and a lot of people have swung far too far in the direction of keeping everything different. And really, there's room to be more vulnerable as leaders, and there's huge benefit from that. So I think while of course you can go too far, for most people, it's better to think about ways in which you can build real relationships with people. And there's this amazing study called the Harvard Grant Study. I don't know if you guys have heard about that, but it was released in like 2014. So it's not now that new, but it was a 75-year longitudinal study looking at happiness in life. And they basically followed a whole bunch of people for 75 years to look at what allowed them to be happy and what caused life satisfaction. And they found out that two things that directly relate to connection were absolutely foundational and were necessary. And one of the things they found was that the diversity of relationships that we have, the more real relationships we have across our entire life, the happier we are. And actually, that's really needed in order to be happy. Then, if we are happy, there's tons of data to say that we're far more productive, we're far more effective, we're better in the workplace.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I think Kat's also just shared the link for the Harvard Grant Study for those who are interested to learn more.
That's great. There's also an amazing TED Talk that captures the key points from it. So hopefully we can share that with people as well.
Cool. You also briefly spoke about the 12 social leadership skills that you work on. Can you walk us through what those are, what those means, and why they're important?
Yeah, sure. So So I mentioned, first of all, that my company focuses on social leadership.
Mhm.
So I have quite a long history at Microsoft. And while I was still at Microsoft as a corporate leader, I started thinking about combining corporate social responsibility and leadership development and looking at the power of that. And I started really believing that that was needed. And I did some work in that space when I was still at Microsoft and loved it. I actually found out that was where my passion really was. So when I left, so I've had my company for 6 years. And when I left Microsoft, I decided that was really where I wanted to focus. And so we help develop, first of all, we help organizations to bring their social purpose to life through their people, okay? And we focus on developing social leaders. So people often ask what that is, so I can explain. So social leaders have the right skills and perspectives and self-awareness to have an impact at the company, at a business level, and at a societal level. Because when we look at what's needed in the world today, we actually need to provide what's called shared value, which is value not only for our shareholders, but also for a broader world. And actually younger generations are seeing that and believe in that more and more. So, so the skills that we have identified are the ones that help you be successful in both of those domains. So does that make sense, first of all?
Yes, for me it does, because I've read a lot about it.
Okay.
If you have more questions about it, let us know in the chat.
Yeah, please do ask. So I can say a little bit more, which is the two challenges that I brought up, or opportunities that I brought up around connection and context leadership, are what the skills are focused on. And so we have 12, 6 in each domain. And we have a self-assessment on our website that helps people kind of get a sense for where they stand on these. It's really just a reflection, self-reflection exercise to get you thinking. But you can see what all of those skills are and learn more about yourself on our website. It's just a little quick free assessment.
Yeah, I would recommend you to do that, because I've done the test earlier before this conversation. And I think the ones with the results that I got, the ones that I guess resonate the most with me are transparent and accountable. And since I have you here, can we talk around what transparent and accountable are?
Sure. Can I ask, Javian, were those your strengths or areas for development, or just ones that you thought were relevant?
I think those were my strengths, I feel.
Okay. So first of all, I'd say we've used these 12 skills and worked with these 12 skills now for 6-7 years. And we have like a lot of data points around them. And just to say, interestingly, presence is the one that is the people struggle with the most, actually. So that comes up an awful lot for people, being present. Accountability and transparency are kind of mid-range in terms of their, some people are good and some people struggle. So I guess that's sort of mid-range. So do you want me to just talk about those, Javian, and what they are? Would that be helpful?
Sure.
Okay.
I would love to.
Okay. So one of our 12 is accountability. And that is all about, it's more than taking responsibility. It's all about holding yourself and other people to an appropriately high standard and delivering on what you promise. But it's actually more than that. It's also helping to hold other people accountable by delegating well and making expectations really clear to them. So that's what accountability is. Because we can't be good at what we do if at the end of the day, we don't deliver what we say we'll deliver. So the other one you asked about was transparency. There's a little bit of connection between many of the skills, all the skills probably, if you look, but between accountability and transparency, because like I said, part of accountability is being clear around expectations. And transparency covers being open and transparent around a whole bunch of things. It includes information, so sharing things early so that people can have a conversation and input onto things. It's things like expectations and roles and responsibilities. It's also about things like mistakes. So being transparent when things don't go well and owning up to that. Because if you do that, it basically provides a foundation of trust. And once you are transparent, you're creating a culture that's a more trusting culture across your team.
Yeah, I did, I guess, experience when different types of leaders who handles mistakes fairly differently. The ones who are slightly more open to admitting it and moving forward, and then the ones who probably a little bit less reluctant to do that.
Yeah, we have another skill in R12, which is being courageous. Mm-hmm. And that also deals a lot with making mistakes, of course, because it does take courage in order to admit when you make a mistake. But yes, if you role model that and you do that well, not only does it allow other people to do that too and know that that's okay, but actually, of course, it allows for more innovation. Because if we don't make mistakes and admit our mistakes and learn from those mistakes, it's hard to innovate. So again, coming back to working in an agile world and being able to deal in an agile way, being courageous to own up to your mistakes is really essential.
Are there any one of these skills that you think are, the most important one that leaders should have, or that it's quite hard to say which ones? Or if there you have a favorite?
I don't think so. I think they're all totally important, and it's very specific to the individual where an individual could and should focus. Like I wouldn't do leadership development if I didn't believe that all leaders can get even better. And so I think some people are quite strong at a lot of them and maybe only have a couple of gaps. Some people have lots to work on, but I would always suggest that people start with one. If we spread ourselves too thin and try to do too much, it's just not successful. So if you do my self-assessment, I would pick one thing that you think you want to work on and think of ways to do that in like a tangible way in your work.
Right. How do you see then the difference between a leader and a manager then? Because we've talked a lot about leaders, but do you think, only if you're a manager, then you can be a leader? How does that work?
So I definitely think 100% anyone can be, should be, is a leader. Okay. So, but it's funny because if you'd asked me that, like, this is quite contentious, actually. I mean, there are different views on leadership versus management and the definition of each. But for me, they are related, but different. But if you asked me like 15, 20, actually maybe probably now 25 years ago, how scary is that? I did get asked that. I did a talk on leadership when I was an early manager at Microsoft. And I made the argument they were the same. And here's why I made the argument they were the same. I really loved the leadership dimension of management. And I couldn't really imagine being a manager without being a leader. And so I couldn't see the distinction because I was looking at it from the management angle, but I had never considered it the other way around. So if you flip that around, 100% absolutely, it's taken me too long to recognize this, but leaders can exist without being a manager and do exist without being a manager. So management is more about a position you hold, and it's slightly more about controlling people and resources. Control is a strong word, but it's about having real direct line responsibility for resources and processes and results. Leadership is more of a mindset. It's really a way of thinking about how you engage people. And I like to say that it's about helping people work together towards a common vision.
Yeah, so you can actually be a leader without having to manage anyone.
Absolutely, yes. And I mean, the way we think about those social leadership skills, I've worked with those with teenagers. Like we've gone into schools and worked with them on the social leadership skills, and they're relevant even with that age group.
Interesting. So going back to the 12 social skills, for those who have done the test and wants to improve on things, how do you suggest they keep track of their progress? How do you suggest they monitor if they're getting better at things?
Well, so the best way to improve is to tell people what you're working on and ask them if they will provide you with feedback on how you're doing. And that's with or without an assessment, no matter what you're trying to work on. And there actually was a study around that in the coaching context by a large coaching organization, which proves statistically that if someone says that I want to work on this, they'll make more progress on it than if they don't. And it makes sense, right? Because you're owning up to it, you're taking accountability for it. And you also then have accountability partners that will give you feedback. So that's one piece, is saying what you want to work on. The other thing, I think, if you want to track and make progress on things and find out how you're doing, is to ask. So ask open, curious questions and get feedback. Create an environment where people want to tell you the truth. It's absolutely the most important part of progressing in our careers.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me, if you're starting in your career, asking people feedback could be something that's fairly easy to do. But as you progress into more senior leadership role, especially C-level executive, and how do you suggest those on that spectrum of people ask for feedback?
Well, we work with a lot of C-suite execs and a lot of really senior people. And it's a very lonely place for a lot of leaders, because they get to a place where they feel like they need to be the experts and they can't admit failing, and they don't want to ask for feedback because they don't want to be that vulnerable. So, I mean, if you're already in that level, just know that all of us have to do that in order to continue to grow. And actually your teams and employees will trust you more if you open up and admit what you're working on and listen to the feedback that they have. So if you're already there, that's what I'd say. If you're not there, it's a good time to start practicing getting feedback and admitting your weaknesses and admitting failure, because it gets harder and harder as we get more senior.
Yeah, I think when you're first starting, at least your managers will be the one giving you feedback. And then as you grow, you realize the people who are giving you feedback just become lesser and lesser, because you have to ask to kind of get their feedback as well.
That's right, Javian. Yeah.
So how do you know then when we should seek for external help, not just from our colleagues? Because you mentioned very briefly about coaching, and I've always been curious, what's the difference between mentoring and coaching? How do they work?
Yeah, those are all great questions. So you guys mentioned that we do action learning coaching, which is team coaching. So in my business, I do that and my team do that. We also do a lot of executive one-to-one coaching as well. I think all of us can use a coach. So let me start with the difference between coaching and mentoring, actually, since you asked that. So mentors, as probably most people know, it's about giving advice. It's usually someone who has a similar background and set of experiences to you. And it is more about advising. Coaching is more about holding a mirror up to someone, helping them find their own solutions through asking questions and helping them think about things in new ways. So they're quite different. And I have a mentor and a coach. I have through my whole career for many, many years. I have a business mentor who also coaches me, who I've had since, for more than 20 years. So it can be very, very powerful. And I think you asked, how do you know when you need one? Well, like I say, I think anyone can use one, but I think the important thing is that you're ready to do the work yourself, because sometimes I get asked to coach people, and I always try to meet the person and find out how committed they are first, because what you don't want is to go into a coaching relationship with someone who doesn't want to be there. I want to work with people, and you'll get the most out of coaching if you want to develop yourself and you're ready to do the hard work, because the hard work isn't the coach. The hard work is done by the coachee.
So by doing the hard work, you mean making changes to their day-to-day lives, making actual decisions, or?
Yeah, all of that. I mean, it can be confronting and challenging, thinking about ourselves and really trying to figure out where our weaknesses are. It's not always easy. So you have to kind of be ready for that. but it's amazingly exciting to see yourself develop as well, and to see feedback change on how you're doing against certain skills. So I think the power of getting someone who's outside, well, outside your space. It could be an external executive coach, or it could be someone else that you talk to, but someone with an outside perspective, is that they're more able to see a different perspective on what you're facing.
Yeah, but how do you know if this coach is suitable for you then? How can you tell? There are any criteria?
There are, of course. There are course accreditations and certifications, and it's worth looking at that, because there are a lot of people who call themselves coaches who don't really have the training. I'm not saying they can't be good at it, they might be, but at least you're filtering it down a bit if you look for someone who has some training. But I actually think it's really important that you have good chemistry, because you're going to work with this person really closely. So we usually offer like a chemistry conversation so that we can check if the person wants to work with us and we want to work with them, and it kind of makes sense and the styles align.
Yeah, so Miniclub actually offers coaching classes for managers, which I was very fortunate to be a part of. But through that course, I realized it's not easy. People say, you're just asking questions, but it's not easy trying to, I guess, understand the person, trying not to give your own perspective when you're asking those questions, which I thought was really hard. But do you have any tips on how to become better coaches when facing with these things?
Well, I think it's fantastic that Miniclip's offering it to managers. I think lots of companies are starting to, and I'd say if you get an opportunity to go for a course and get some training, go for it. No matter if it's a day or a week or a month or a year, whatever you get offered, I think take people up on that, because I think it's a fantastic skill set for life, frankly. Let's see. I guess it's hard to summarize what I think you need to learn as a coach here, but I think you can practice your coaching skills by practicing open questions, which we work with leaders on in leadership development programs. And it's shockingly hard for so many people to ask an open question, because we're not really encouraged to in life. We kind of are encouraged to either give advice or ask a closed question and get an answer. But an open question that's not a yes or no answer elicits different response from the person who you're talking to. And so if you know nothing about coaching and you want to start trying to build the skill set, I'd start by practicing asking open questions with people that you engage with, and see the difference between that and asking a yes or no question, because you'll be surprised.
A lot of what, why, and how questions.
Oh, exactly. Not yes or no's. Anything that can't be answered by a yes or no. What ends up happening is in life, we ask lots of closed questions, and the listener kind of knows that you're not really asking them to just say yes or no. No one just goes yes or no. They answer, but when they answer, they're answering with whatever bias that you've put in, or they're kind of guessing what open question you had in mind. And it skews their answers, and it closes down the way they think about the question.
Yeah, very interesting. So we did some practice classes in the sessions as well. And sometimes I think asking questions can go down the rabbit hole as well. When you're asking a certain topic, you just go deep into this, but it's not really the root of the problem. Mm-hmm. So it also feels like you need to take probably a few steps back. When thinking about these.
If I can comment on that. So you said we might come back to action learning. So let me just mention something from action learning, since you mentioned that. So action learning, if you don't know, if you're listening and you don't know, action learning is a team coaching method. And it is small group with a coach, and it's focused on getting a balance between getting real actions on real problems and learning. So developing leadership skills, team skills, so proper learning. And the coach kind of makes sure that there's that balance. And one of the things that action learning is great about is making sure that you unearth the real challenge. Because we spend time, we don't let people go to the solution until there's agreement on the problem. And it can take quite a while, but what we learn from action learning is that if they get agreement on the problem and they go through that process together of co-identifying the problem, then they can really quickly get to solutions. So people often think, oh my God, doesn't that take a long time? Well, no, because it saves time on the other end because you're working on the right problem and you've been involved in that, so the solutions come quicker.
Oh, very interesting point. I've never thought of it that way. Because I think, as you said, we always go into, discussions thinking we all know we're talking about the same problem.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's not aligned in that front.
Often it's not.
Interesting. And on action learning, is this something that, people can start implementing in their teams, or they have to go through proper training before they can implement this?
That's a great question. It's really a method that requires training. When we have people experience it, it sounds very simple, and then people experience it and they're like kind of blown away by it. They often want to take the practices from it, and that is totally possible. So I think when people have experienced it, there are a lot of techniques that they can take and learnings that they can take into their leadership, and they do take into their leadership. Some of it is around an awareness that actually often we're not working on the right problem. So stopping and just asking, what problem are we trying to solve, is valuable. So there are things like that we do in action learning that they can pick up and say, oh, actually, I can do that in my workplace too. And so they do. It's also very focused on open questions. And so people who participate in it get kind of surprised at how hard that is and how powerful it is. And so often leave with a better understanding of that.
Amazing, thank you. Let's talk a little bit, I guess, about difficult times as we talked about earlier, about how fast things are changing these days, and especially with COVID. I think even pre-COVID, it's always been tricky to try and give and receive feedback. When we could do it face to face, at least we could gauge how the other person is responding. Yeah. But now that everything's online, how do you think leaders could improve, I guess, in terms of giving, especially negative feedback, when we're doing it online like this?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think all leaders, or nearly all leaders, okay, not all, that's not true. A lot of leaders struggle with giving feedback. It's a common challenge for people. As you say, especially the more confronting or, difficult feedback, people often don't want to do that. And I think you're right that that's been exacerbated somewhat by working online, because you can't read the body language. Frankly, you often haven't created as rich a connection. And so when you come to give the feedback, you don't have that relationship to kind of draw on. So the very first thing I'd say about giving feedback is it's far easier to give feedback if you have a real relationship with the person to whom you're giving the feedback, because they're less likely to feel threatened by it, and they'll have the context around it to be able to accept it in an easier way. Okay, so that's the first thing I'd say. Practically speaking, I think giving feedback with an example as immediately as possible after a situation occurs is always better. The worst thing you could do is wait until performance review time once a year and then spring a whole load of constructive feedback on someone. I mean, that's really hard. I always used to say as a manager that we didn't want to surprise our employees at performance review time. Nothing you say in a performance review should surprise an employee if you've done your job well. So I think that's part of it. I mean, I think the more regularly you can give feedback, positive and constructive, as you see it, the better. I also think we too often label people, and there's something called a threat response that's about brain science. And we can create a threat response in people when we label people. And so avoiding that, and instead talking about the impact that the behavior or situation has had on us and the business, can help to provide better context for the person so that they can respond more constructively to the feedback.
So it doesn't sound like a personal attack For example,
Correct. Yeah, you don't want to attack. And unfortunately, because people aren't skilled and experienced at it and they don't practice it enough, that's the way it can come across. I think practicing before you give the feedback, if you're going into some really challenging feedback, it's worth like writing down what you're going to say and thinking through how you want to approach it.
Yeah, it feels like the labeling could sometimes happen not intentionally, but because sometimes you can just comes out and then people will be like, what did you just say? And then I feel like as soon as you call the label out, the person also shuts down and everything you say.
Yeah.
Will go through.
There's some really interesting research about neuroscience, about threat responses. And we respond to social threats in the same way as physical threats from like a brain perspective. And so what we're basically doing when we label is we create a threat response, which immediately causes people to not be able to respond as rationally. It's like going to the primitive part of the brain and making that be the prominent part, and you don't want that. So.
Right. Amazing. Some things to practice then. But on the other side of the spectrum, I think, apart from, it's challenging giving difficult feedback, it's also quite hard to motivate people and to try and, keep them positive in this time. How would you say, what are your suggestions if how we can better motivate our team, especially during this time?
Yeah, so I mean, inspiring is one of the 12 social leadership skills, and so is giving, and they kind of relate to each other in some ways. I think, first of all, I think if as leaders we can role model the behavior we want to see, then we're more likely to get that from people, and that's very motivating for people. I also think that it's very important that we know and we're able to articulate our purpose, because if we act from a position of purpose, it actually is incredibly inspiring for other people. So too often as leaders, we kind of jump into what people are doing, and we don't pull back to like, why are they doing it? What are we here for? And the more alignment you can get around that, the more motivating I think it is for people.
Amazing. Yeah, I feel like the whys are always very powerful when you start sharing to people why they're doing some things. And it doesn't feel as mundane, I guess.
Yeah.
There's also, I guess, a few specialists on this call who is not people manager, but still, I guess, what we discussed before, wants to be leaders. Do you think leadership skills are equally important to them if they're not managing someone? How does it help with our career in general then?
Yeah, so like I said before, I actually think everyone acts as a leader really in life at various points, and we can all step up to be leaders. And that might be in our families, it might be with groups that we're just working with and alongside. It can be even with people who are more senior to you. You can still use these behaviors to be more effective. So absolutely 100% think that everyone can and should, and it's great if everyone continues to think about how they can be more effective. This isn't about a position. It's not about a position.
Right. But especially for, I guess, new managers, how do you suggest they kind of split, from not having managed anyone to suddenly become manager of 3 or 5 people? How do you suggest they grow into this mindset, if there are any tips at all?
Well, if you've never thought about kind of leadership before, and you suddenly get both management and leadership responsibilities, right? I think, first of all, having an awareness that there is this additional part of management, like when you're in a management role, I still think you have to do leadership. Like, I don't think you can be an effective manager without doing some leadership. I think it's very hard. So I think thinking about those different dimensions is really important. Like I said at the start, I think that leadership is about helping people come together toward a common goal or toward a common purpose or vision. So if you know that's part of your responsibility and you can articulate what that vision is for people, then you're already kind of stepping up into that leadership space. And I mean, more practically, if you want to do the self-assessment and think about what specifically you think you're bringing, I think that's always good. Finally, I'd also add ask, right? So when if push comes to shove and you don't know what you should do, ask for feedback, and you'll get feedback.
For you personally, I guess, because you said you started this company 6 years ago. How's that been then for your journey, watching how these leaders work versus work in a corporate before? Has that changed you a lot?
Well, I'm not actually sure how to respond to that. I don't know which dimension you're interested in. It was a huge change for me. Yeah, I mean, if there's anyone on the line who is thinking about, if they'd ever want to start their own business after a corporate career, I didn't honestly know that I would. I really loved being in a corporate job, but I have absolutely 100% loved it. And I always say that every step I've taken in my career has taken me closer and closer to who I really am. So I really feel like I'm way more able to fulfill my purpose in this role than I have in the past. In terms of leading, like I was in a lot of leadership roles when I was in the corporate world. And I was also in some roles where I wasn't formally managing, but I was managing kind of matrix teams. So I did both. In my job now, I work alongside and with, and I guess I lead a whole group of associates. And, it's one of my favorite parts of the job. So that hasn't changed. I loved that before and I love that now.
Yeah. Would you say this is your favorite part, or would you say, getting to work with all these different leaders or?
Well, I love working with my team and co-delivering really effective work. Okay, I love that. I love working with my clients and seeing both their similarities and their differences, but having the diversity of challenges that I get to work on is really exciting because, I work sometimes I do one-to-one coaching with one client, and then I'll go and do a big, large scale 100-person leadership development program with another client. And then I'll go straight into an 8-part webinar series with 200 people. So, it's very varied and I really love that, and different topics as well.
Amazing. Before we move on to, I guess, the Q&A section from the audience, can I just ask one last question? Because you said you love working with your team. Can you share with us one tip? How did you foster your relationship with your team, and how do you manage to grow them so well that you really enjoy working with them now?
Well, I think I try to use those connection skills. I mean, I try to practice those connection skills that I talked to you guys about and that are in the assessment. I think I have quite a lot of passion around what I do. And I think that people pick up on that. So I think my team feels part of that, and I want them to. So I think I trust them completely 100%. We have a good trust relationship across our team. And I try to be very open to feedback and admit my mistakes and all those things we talked about. That I just think, I'm true, I'm honest, I'm authentic with them, and they are with me. And that just is a great foundation for a good relationship.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Kat's already gathered some questions that we've got from the audience, so I'll read them through now. The first one is, do you feel that the pandemic has accelerated the shift away from autocratic leadership?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's a great potential silver lining of the pandemic that I think leaders have recognized in a lot of cases that autocratic leadership isn't very effective, especially when we're all distributed and online. So it kind of forces people to make the change that I would have hoped they would have made anyway. And some people are doing it well, and some people are really struggling with it. But certainly I think virtual and hybrid working requires that we step away from that autocratic method if we haven't already.
Is there any preference for you and your team? Do you prefer to work hybrid or work in the office, or?
Oh, well, do you mean for us as a team or for what we recommend to our clients? For us as a team. So
as well as what you recommend to your clients.
Oh, interesting. So my team are distributed all over the world. We rarely come together in person. We used to when we were delivering in person, and we're starting to again, those who are delivering in person. But we do a ton of work delivered virtually. like this, through Zoom and Teams, et cetera. And so I think we, by default, work online. And to be honest, I haven't seen any of my team in person in a long, long, long time, but I feel 100% connected to them and I speak to them almost every day. So I can't believe how long it's been. Like, it doesn't seem like it because I see them all the time. In terms of recommendations to clients, I think it's very dependent on the client situation. And I absolutely believe in hybrid working. I'm really a believer in online options and situations where online is more effective.
Mm.
I think it's tricky when you're the only person online and there are a whole bunch of people in a room. And I think that's very, very hard to do well. Early in my career at Microsoft, I was in that position, and I used to be on a team where I was sitting in London and the rest of my team were all in Seattle, and they would push their donut boxes around on the table in the morning, in my evening, and then they'd go off and get coffee at the start. And this was way before anybody was working online. We were on conference calls, and literally all I could hear was like this donut box, like getting pushed across the table and getting back pushed. It was horrible. And they'd always forget I was there. And luckily I'm quite extroverted, so I didn't let them forget, but I was just like this voice that would pipe up from nowhere. So things have moved on a little bit since then, but I still think that that form of hybrid is very, very, very hard to get right.
Thank you.
Sure.
Moving on to the next question. What are the best tools or dynamics do you suggest to improve as a leader?
Oh, tools. So I think, I'll go back first of all the way to the fundamentals and just say, asking for feedback and trying to get better reality around how you're behaving. So remember that perception and reality are two different things. We can believe that we're doing a fantastic job, and we may or may not be. And so getting data around that by asking questions is pretty foundational. I know that's not a tool per se, but it's something we all can do. And actually it's highly effective. I like to read. So I think there's so much great stuff out there. I don't even know where to start really in terms of recommending. There are lots of great frameworks. So I think HBR, so Harvard Business Review, has amazing research and articles, and oftentimes it links to books if you want to know more. Same with TED Talks. I think that's a great resource, but what I'd often do is go to the book that is underneath that to find out more if you're interested. And then, there are lots of assessments as well, which can tell you a lot about yourself. My favorite ones are one called Hogan and one called Leadership Circle Profile. Hogan is a self-assessment and Leadership Circle Profile is a 360, but there are just tons out there and a lot of them are good. I think go back to the fundamentals and try to get more reality around your perceptions.
Yeah, asking questions I feel is the hard part because one, you don't know what people will say, and two is, do you have the heart to actually listen to what people will say if harsh reality when it happens? Yeah,
that's right.
But actually, the next question is asking about your reading recommendation, which you've shared. But this one is, I guess, more specific on reading recommendations on social leadership or action learning. Does Hogan relate as well?
Not directly, no. So Hogan and Leadership Circle Profile are, aren't directly related to social leadership or action learning specifically. On action learning, there are a bunch of good books. I co-authored one, so I guess I can mention that, but
yes,
it's Optimizing the Power of Action Learning, the third edition of that I was co-author on. I think, it tells you a lot about action learning if you're new to it. It is quite a specific coaching kind of skill set. So if you're more on the technical side, the author, the first author on that is a guy named Michael Marquardt. And he wrote a book called Leading with Questions that I think is really great for managers. So I would, if you're a manager and you're interested in, or a technical specialist and you're interested in learning more about action learning, I would start with that because it's sort of action learning, but applied to the management role a little more. And on the social leadership front, I would love to have a book to tell you I'd written, and hopefully I will at some point, but I'm spending too much time doing client work and not writing. So that's not done. I think social leadership, in terms of how we define it, has quite a lot of dimensions. And I think there's a lot of really great research out there around positive impact and purpose that you can read. I don't have real specific recommendations, but a lot of the big consultancies do a lot of good work on that. McKinsey, for one.
I think you've also shared some resources with us before, Shannon, on reading. Yeah,
I have. So I've shared with you readings around each of the 12 skills, and they're just a sample, but they're ones that we think are helpful. So yeah, if you can share those with people, that would be great.
Yes, we will be sending them in our newsletter next week, so people have more of these to read on. 2 final questions, if you don't mind. Do you have any recommendations for someone who's building up a management training program for managers?
Oh, so I don't know, is it someone who is working in the leadership development space, or is it a manager who's doing it? You know?
I believe this is the COO of a company asking.
Okay, all right. So I think the recommendation I would have is to focus first on what it is you want to develop. So did you say it's a management
training program,
training program
for managers?
Yeah. Okay, so I think there are lots of ways you can focus in management. And if it's for a specific company or a specific organization, it's going to depend on the size of the organization to some degree. But I would start by really figuring out what it is you're trying to solve. What problem are you trying to solve? So if you can have conversations with your managers and your employees maybe, and leaders, to try to see where the gaps are and where the focus should be, that would really help you. So if I were going in to help, we'd almost start always with either questions like that to the person who's asking, or diagnostics in the organization. Yeah, that's where I'd start. It's hard to say without knowing the specifics, but that would at least give you a sense for where to focus in your training.
Yeah. So she's add additional context. So this program is to level up their people managers.
Okay, so probably still my answer applies, but that's helpful. Thank you. I think there are often gaps for people managers in some of the skills we've talked about. So giving and receiving feedback, holding people accountable, having more of a coaching mindset, so I would probably think about, again, where are the gaps that you see most, and what are the problems that are popping up within that population. But I think those are often areas that come up for people managers that they need to develop.
Amazing. So we've got feedback. She said all of those are spot on. Yeah,
they're common. That's not just you.
Amazing. Hopefully that answers your question. Otherwise, give us more context for that. And the last question we have here is, how do you deliver context leadership and be transparent with your team when there are critical situations that you want to shelter them from?
Yeah, transparency often comes up as a one that people think, how can I do that? Because there are things I can't share. And that's clearly true, right? There are things in leadership roles, the more senior we get, we learn some things that we cannot share. But I'd go back to that pendulum and say that we swing far too far. Almost everyone I speak to, I rarely speak to a leader who's too transparent. It can happen, but usually we're not transparent enough. And so we can move that dial and increase the way in which we involve people to get them on board and help them be part of the journey, so that when changes happen, they're ready for them. Because think back, I'm sure all of you have been in change situations. And if you know a little bit more about what's happening, you're more readily able to accept that. And you don't get as much threat response when you hear what's actually happening. So I think it's about really challenging yourself around what you can say and what you cannot say. And I'm obviously saying that within the constraint of, there are things we cannot. But what can you share? what can you share that will be helpful? And if you can't share information about what's happening from a business perspective, what can you share about yourself so that when they learn that information from you, they're more able to take it in because they know and trust you.
Amazing. Final question before we close this. What's your favorite part, Shannon, about being a leader? What do you like most about being a leader?
I like co-development. I love motivating people to come along on a journey. And I like what I learned from that. And I like the results that come from that. I just love that. That's my favorite bit.
Amazing. Hopefully all the resources you shared today can help more people become better leaders, especially at what they do as well. Thank you for that.
I'm very happy to have anyone reach out to me directly if they have any questions as well. It's no problem.
Amazing. You can, I guess, find Shannon on LinkedIn as well.
Yes, you can. You can also find beleadership.com. So it's be-leadership.com. You can find all about what we do, and you can do the self-assessment, etc. Maybe that's been already shared in the link. But yeah, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to hear from any of you. And thank you again so much for letting me be part of this. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, it was lovely speaking to you. I'm glad we finally have this episode. Really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Shannon.
Thank you.
Yes, I think everybody had a really good time. I mean, for me, like context, giving people context and being more human is something that, at least in the video game industry, I think we do need to work on. And just, being more open, asking more open questions and caring more about people and having human relations. That's so important. So thank you very much. I know that it's a question I'm sure a lot of people have, like what kind of leaders do we want to have in this industry? And